Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Under the Surface. Today, I am your only host, Riley. My normal co host, Daniel, is unfortunately not able to join me for this episode due to some last minute things that have come up. And we just wanted to get an episode out for you guys and decided that it would just be best if I went ahead and did this one solo. So that may be a little difficult for this podcast format, but we're going to give it a best shot. I got my good helper here. What remains of it? The best Gatorade flavor ever, lime cucumber. No argument. That is objectively true. That it is the best flavor. And if you say it's disgusting, you're wrong. Anyways, today we're getting into the second part of this basic church history overview that we're doing. And in this episode, I'm going to go over the 7th through 14th centuries, or at least I'm going to attempt to. We have a lot to cover today, and I'm going to try and get through it quickly but also thoroughly so that you guys can have a good overview of the major important things that happened within Christian church history from the 7th through the 14th centuries. I've got a lot of notes here. I'll probably be glancing down a lot. Normally, whenever I have we have a co-host here like Daniel, or Daniel has a co-host with me, one of us is able to kind of read and brush up on the notes that we're about to cover, while the other one is talking about the notes that they went over. Because I'm by myself, I'm going to be having to do a lot of looking down to, take note of what I have written down here, what I've prepared. And then from there, we will maybe do some pausing here and there. And so it may look like I'm doing a bunch of cuts, but if I need to kind of make sure what I'm reading is correct, or what I'm saying is correct, so that I'm not giving incorrect information out here. So this is a very important subject. I may be doing that more, but anyways, beyond all that rambling, let's go ahead and get into it. So the main thing I want to point out first is that we need to remember that the end of our last episode, we covered the 6th century, so the 500s, and we kind of went over how the 4th and then leading into the 5th century are kind of like a golden era of expansion for Christianity. Insofar as you had very important doctrines being formed or being expounded upon. You had very important things like the Council of Nicaea. You had the first ecumenical councils popping up. And beyond that, you just really had Christianity expanding and shaping into what would lead into the 7th century. And so, obviously, hearing all that and hearing that it was such a golden age, and that Christianity was now being accepted by the Roman government, and that there was toleration towards Christianity, you would think that would continue into the 7th century. Unfortunately, that's just not the case, because whereas places like the 4th century were a golden age, the 7th century was very catastrophic for the church in a few ways. So if you look at the start of the 7th century, so around 600 AD, the Christian world as a whole was still conceptualized as something like Christendom, or a belt of territories around the Mediterranean that all influenced the Roman, or historians at this time begin to call the Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. So we'll say, well, for the simplify, we'll call it the Roman Empire, but just keep in mind that at this point, if you read church history, it may start to be referred to as the Byzantine Empire to kind of show the shift into the Middle Ages. But the Roman Empire and the great patriarchs of the Roman Empire, places like Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, etc., these were all deeply involved in things like the Christian political sphere. And unfortunately, though, they were divided very theologically, or they began to see some division theologically because of things that were discussed in the one of the last councils to talk about, which is the Second Council of Constantinople, where we began to see affirmation of the previous councils alongside condemning of the three chapters. And so one of those other councils that was approved of was the Council of Chalcedon. And so what is important about this is that the Chalcedonian language was one that discussed the natures of Christ between the two natures, which is the Orthodox Christian view, which is the Chalcedonian view, versus the one nature, which is the monophysite view. And this is the view that you see within a place like the Oriental Orthodox today. This was causing a theological rift to form in some places, hence why the Oriental Orthodox still do exist to this day. And so at the beginning of that's what sort of what you see at the beginning of the 600s, and then you see a shift by the end of the 600s towards the year 700 or 699, if you want to be technical, retaining the 7th century here. We begin to see that the big explosion of Islam, the birth of Islam into the scene, really had impacted Christianity a lot at this time already. Some very ancient and important Christian strongholds like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria were now, at this point, under Islamic rule, under the rule of Muslims. And so, because of that, we begin to see here the biggest indicator of a split within Christianity, and that is between the Greek East, which was struggling to battle against Islam and to survive amidst the Islamic rule, and they're settling their own theological disputes as well, against the Latin West, which was at this time trying somewhat to try and get some help from Germanic tribes like the Anglo-Saxons for political support. And at this time they're also expanding the papacy, and you begin to see the papacy develop more here. And so essentially what you see is that the Greek East and the Latin West have begun to split some. At this time, they are still unified as a church. It's very important that we don't forget that. The real split didn't really happen until the 11th century. However, here you begin to see some splinters form that would lead up to the split, to where you're not going to be surprised when we come up to that and you begin to see the Great Schism happen. All of this stuff leading up to it is a very good indicator for the people at the time, or for us now, that something was coming. Now, coming off of the Council of Chalcedon, where they discussed the natures of Christ, you had the issue of, similar to the natures of Christ, the wills of Christ. And so this was discussed at a council within the 7th century, and that is the Third Council of Constantinople, where it was affirmed that Christ does have two wills, and he does not just have one will. The view that Christ has two wills is the Orthodox one. This view is called dithelitism, and the view that Christ only has one will is called monothelitism, and this is the heretical view. And something that's actually kind of interesting that would later be sort of an embarrassment, in my opinion, for the Roman Catholic view of the papacy would be that at this council, Pope Honorius I was declared a heretic. And what's kind of weird about this is that was deceased at this point. And so this is just something that's interesting because it played a big role in, it would later play a role in how people viewed the popes, right? Because this would lead the East to view them in a more, negative fashion in some sense. And today it is somewhat of an embarrassment to say, well, you went ahead and declared a deceased pope as a heretic. It seems kind of strange. And there's a lot of other stuff that kind of went around on in the 7th century, but again, we're just trying to focus on the most important ones here. One of the most important people, I did want to point him out because oftentimes in discussions of church history, I feel like his presence maybe isn't discussed as much as it should be. That is of Maximus the Confessor, who played a big role in the arguments and the theology against monothelitism, and he provided a lot of arguments for why dithelitism, or the belief that Christ has two wills, is the true and correct correct view. And so I do want to point him out because he's very important at this time. Now, moving on to the 8th century, it is very apparent that at this time the Christians are still struggling to battle against Islam, and it is still spreading rapidly throughout the Christian world. But there's not really much for me to say on that other than going into deep historical background, and honestly, there are points I'll probably mention throughout the coverage here of the 8th century, but one of the most important things that people will point out within the 8th century isn't actually having anything to do with the spread of Islam, but rather has to do with the iconoclasm controversy, or the the controversy surrounding whether or not images were okay, or holy images were okay to use and to venerate. So, because of this, in 787, the Empress Irene summoned the Second Council of Nicaea, which is the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and this is the final council that both the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic churches both hold to. After this, the councils after this, only the Roman Catholics hold to. The Orthodox, again, only hold to the 1st through 7th ecumenical councils. So this council was broadly to discuss the veneration of icon and iconoclasm, and whether or not iconoclasm was true, or that icons were okay or not. And so this council ended up condemning iconoclasm and restored the veneration of icons. And what it did was it defined the boundaries for using icons. So this is a very crucial point to make. It made a theological distinction between latrua, which is worship that is to God alone, and proskynesis, or proskuneo, which is honorary reverence, or that is given to images, or veneration that is given to images. So it's defining the fact that you are not to worship the images, you are only to venerate or give reverence to the images. And oftentimes a sort of image that people like to give for the use of icons and veneration is a soldier who is in battle and he's kissing a picture of his wife at home. Essentially, they're saying that the honor he's giving to that image is actually going to the person beyond the image. And so that's what this council is trying to get at. Now, whether or not you agree with that or not is not what's in question here. I'm just giving you what this council was getting at, or what they were trying to discuss. Whether or not it was okay to do that to an image, for example, the example I gave of the soldier, or whether or not that was considered worship and not okay. So again, at the Second Council of Nicaea, they determined that veneration of icons is okay, worship of icons is not. Another very important thing that happened around 756 AD was the donation of King Pepin. And what this was a time when King Pepin had defeated the Lombards in Italy, and when he did this, he granted some of the territories that he captured to the papacy. And so what this is, it created things called papal states. And why this is so important is because at this point, this made the Pope, at this point, a secular land-ruling monarch for the very first time. Again, this is a huge shift in the duty of the papacy, to where now the Pope is literally a monarch of these territories that were gifted to the papacy by King Pepin. Very, very important shift in the role of the papacy and the duty of the Pope. Now, a very important figure within the entire iconoclasm, sorry, I got tongue twister there. The debate surrounding that was actually a man named John of Damascus. I want to mention him because he was very important here. He wrote a writing called the Fountain of Knowledge, and this was one of the primary theological works defending the icon, or icon veneration, and it was played a very big part in icons being seen as okay to venerate from the Second Council of Nicaea. Now, moving away from icons and such, the last thing I really want to cover, or I guess there's two things I want to cover here now I think about it. One of them is the fact that the adoptionism began to pop up yet again around this time. And so this was something that had to be battled against. And so there's arguments, and eventually, obviously, you know that adoptionism was defeated. But it is important to point out that this was beginning to pop up around this time. It was actually coming from Spain, interesting enough. But it was battled out. And then another very important thing that started happening here is that the Western churches. So again, let's take a step back here, actually, before I get into this. Remember that there have been two councils now dealing with the will of Christ, and then the natures of Christ, and then another council dealing with that. This is the Council of Nicaea, the divinity of Christ. So throughout all of this, the divinity of Christ is being challenged, or the nature of his being is being challenged over and over and over again. Now, what some historians, and I find this to be somewhat plausible, hence why I brought this up or added that background and why I'm about to say this, some historians have begun to argue that this is one of the reasons why the Western Church began to add the Filioque to the Nicene Creed. And that began to happen around this time. So it started in Spain earlier. However, it gained some official status under Charlemagne in the 8th century. So this is when you can see the East reject it. And this is one of the things that would lead up to the Schism. The Filioque, for those who don't know, the Nicene Creed stated originally that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father. The later addition was the Filioque. So this stated then that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. The and the Son is the Filioque. So when you hear the Filioque controversy come up, that's why it's here. So people think that this is a small difference, but it really isn't. This is a very, very big theological deal, because it's challenging the nature of the Trinity, right? It's a fundamental difference in the Trinity. And so this was a very big deal that would later lead to the Great Schism. One of the biggest issues that would lead to the Great Schism in the 11th century, and you begin to see it pop up here in the 8th century. Now, when discussing the 9th century now, a lot of what's going to be discussed here is kind of a kind of results from stuff that happened in the 7th and 8th century. So this is going to be a quicker one. I just want to point out a few important things that happened because they are important, but a lot of it would be kind of me restating stuff I've already stated over already in regards to the last few centuries. And so on the 9th century, one of the very first things that happened was that Pope Leo III would crown Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. And he did this on Christmas Day, for those interested. The reason why this is important is because this is when you begin to see the Holy Roman Empire begin to form. And this created a rival politically to Byzantium, and it kind of would then, it would start to cement the alliance between the papacy and the Franks, because we see this religious alliance begin to form, and again you begin to see the Holy Roman Empire form here. And again, this would lead to things like Charlemagne affirming the Filioque, Pope Leo III agreeing theologically to it, but they hadn't yet changed the creed officially, although at this time there are some that speculate, or I can't remember how strong the evidence for this is. I don't have this noted down. I should have. So take it with a grain of salt. However, there's speculation, at the very least, that the West began, because of what we discussed earlier, them being nervous about the deity of Christ being challenged, to begin to recite the creed, the Filioque within the Nicene Creed. Although, again, it's important to note, at this point, it was not officially added to the Nicene Creed. Another thing that happened here is, again, this is more evidence of the cracks between the East and the West being shown, is the Photian Schism. And so what happened here is that the Patriarch Photius of Constantinople actually excommunicated Pope Nicholas I. And then in return, the Pope excommunicated Photius. And so this was the first official formal rapture, rather, that you see between the Eastern and the Western churches. And it was, again, centered on the papal authority as a whole, and again, the Filioque clause. These are two very big deals that resulted here now in the first official formal split within the Eastern and the Western churches. By and large, those are the two or the few most important things that happened. However, I do want to mention one other thing that is a pretty popular point to bring up in church history, because it's sort of crazy when you think about it. This is one of those church history facts that I find a lot of people who don't even study church history know about, because obviously they've just heard it because it's a crazy story that's been told. But in 897, there was what is called the Cadaver Synod. So this is one of the lowest points of the papacy, in my humble opinion. And this is when Pope Stephen the Sixth, if I'm not mistaken, yes, Sixth, had the corpse of his predecessor, who was Pope Formosus. I can never say his name right. I've heard so many people say it, but I can never say it. Formosus, I think is how you say it. Pope Formosus. He had him exhumed, dressed in robes, put on trial, and then mutilated. And this was because of obviously disagreements between two. And to me, this would start to symbolize some of the moral collapse of the Roman hierarchy that you saw at the time, or at the end of this century, at the end of the 9th century. And again, this is a very popular story, and it goes even deeper. That's a very, very baseline covering of it, but you could go deeper into this to see everything they did. And it truly was one of those points of the papacy that made people question the true authority and nature of the papacy. Obviously, it wasn't enough to destroy the papacy completely, because people still do hold to the Roman Catholic view and hold to the papacy today. But still, it is one that is important to go over, because it did start to show again how important these theological beliefs were to people, even to drive people like the Pope to do things like this. Other than that, another small thing, I'm not going to go deep into this, but you started to see some discussion over the nature of predestination arise at this time, and then you also started to see the first hints of people deviating from the real presence view of the Eucharist to go towards more of a spiritual view of it. I'm not going to go to that too much, because both of those are going to come into much more importance later on in church history, but it is neat to note that you do see some hints at debate around these topics here. Now, a lot of these ideas that we've been discussing would go on to spread into the 10th century. And truth be told, there's just not a lot I have here for us to go over. The 10th century was important for growth of Christianity, but broadly, it didn't really have any huge theological things happen. I could be totally wrong on that, but from what I understand of what I've read and the notes that we have here, it doesn't seem like the 10th century was as huge for theological growth as it was for just general growth of Christianity. So this is both seen as the Dark Ages in some way for the Romans, but at the same time, not so much, because you did see for the Roman Catholic Church a revival of the Holy Roman Empire as well in 962. So later on in the 10th century, but still within the 10th century, you did see a rebirth of the Holy Roman Empire. But regardless, going right back, we're just going to go over a few important points. So at the very start of the century, we had Western Europe being attacked by Vikings from the north of them, and then from the east there were other enemies. For some reason I don't have who they were. If I'm not mistaken, they were the Magyars, I believe. But for some reason I obviously meant to go back and add that, and I didn't. But I believe that's who it was. And then by the end of the 10th century, you saw that the broad chaos of the battling that began in the 10th century had begun to stabilize somewhat, and that there was a bit of a spiritual revival or revolution happening. And again, the Holy Roman Empire had been revived under a German king, and the German king was actually King Otto the Great. And then among all of this, the most significant change you saw within the 10th century is that the Christendom or Christianity had begun to expand drastically into this time, which is obviously great. At this time, at the end of the 10th century, you saw that the Vikings, the Slavs, the Hungarians, and the Russians had all begun to embrace Christianity. And so you saw that this expanded the faith from the all the way from the Atlantic to like the Volga. And so this was very, very big for Christianity. And again, so in the East, while the West did struggle some at the beginning, in the East, this was really a golden age, because you saw a lot of their military power, their arts, their mysticism, and their spirituality grow quite a bit in the Macedonian dynasty. And so, again, this is just broadly, those are the most important things that happened in the 10th century. There's just not a whole lot to go on there. It was a very, very important time for Christianity, mainly due to expansion and not because of, again, theological development that you saw. And now we arrive at probably the most important and in terms of the future of Christianity, and one of the most popular eras of Christian church history, and that is the 11th century. So during the 11th century, there's a lot going on. You have the Great Schism in 1054. You have the corruption of the papacy occurring. You have the the issue of three different popes all competing, claiming to be the true pope. And there is just a lot that is going on and happening, and a lot of developments within the West specifically. And so let's just go back broadly to the first of the start of the 11th century, which is the year 1000. So at this time, the papacy, again, we see corruption happening in the 10th century, and it leads over here, was essentially just like a local Italian lordship of sorts, and it lost all that it was. And it was sometimes being bought and sold by some Roman families. We'll get into some specific instances of this, but broadly, this was a huge deal because obviously that's not what the papacy is supposed to be. The Western Church had fragmented some, with kings and nobles appointing their own bishops when that was not the intention at all. And then you had the East, moving away from the West, you had the East that was growing very strong politically, but again was starting to move away from the West, and that would result 50 years later in the Great Schism. So by the end of the 11th century, you see that the religious map and the geopolitical map was completely redrawn, with the East and West being, at this point, essentially completely split. And then this would lead to things like obviously the First Crusade and such. And then again, in 1054, the East and West finally snapped to cause the division that is still prevalent to this day. However, there is something very big that happened in this time, especially in the West, which was an intellectual revival that saw the birth of scholasticism. And if you're not aware, scholasticism is very big in the Western church, and specifically in churches like the Roman Catholic Church. And this is a very rigorous approach to applying logic to theology, or reason to theology. And reason is very important in the Roman Catholic and Western churches, especially. And this would lay the groundwork for medieval universities and the birth of the university. And if you didn't know, a little fun fact, things like hospitals and in this case universities are actually Christian. They're birthed out of Christianity, and this is just essentially where they came from. And so a lot of people don't realize that, but that it is absolutely that's the case. Something interesting in 1046, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, at this time, going back to what we were discussing earlier, he would arrive in Rome to find that three rival popes were all claiming the chair of Peter. They were all claiming to be the true pope. So, this came about from years of people battling about who was and wasn't the pope. At one point, a pope was elected, but then people later fled and said, "Never mind, we kind of elected him under duress, and so he actually wasn't a valid election. So we need to elect another person." So they elected another person. However, the original people were saying, "Hey, that's not fair. Like, he is the true pope." Well, they were saying, "No, the second pope is the true pope." And after all this battling, another group went and said, "Well, let's elect another one, and this one's the true one." And obviously, he was beginning to say he was true pope, and the first and second were claiming that still. That just electing a third one didn't change anything or didn't help with anything. And so what Henry III did was he deposed all three of those popes and instead appointed a reformer and another pope to essentially be the true pope. And so that's one of the craziest things, one of the craziest stories. Again, that's one that most people know about, is the time when there was 3 popes and the huge deal that caused to everything. Now, we're going to go now into the Great Schism in 1054, and this was initiated. I mean, again, we see the cracks forming a lot, but one of the final straws was when Cardinal Humbert, who was representing the Roman Church, the Western Church, marched into the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople during a liturgy service being performed, and placed a bowl of excommunication on the altar against the Patriarch of Constantinople, who was Michael Silurius. And so this was essentially the West excommunicating the East. And in response, the East and the Patriarch of Constantinople gave right back to the West another excommunication. So they had both excommunicated each other. Thus, you have the formalized split between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, the Great Schism that so many people talk about. Now, this is also when you begin to see, coming after this, you can see more of a development of papacy. And one of the things that developed was the election method of the papacy, due to the 3 popes, controversy and everything. They essentially decided that they needed to have a better way to elect popes. And so, as a result, they went ahead and chose that popes should be elected by cardinals instead of the Roman mob or the emperor. So, again, now we see this still today. The mechanism for electing a pope is now in the hands of the cardinals instead of the people or the emperor. Now, I just want to get into 3 more things before we head into the 12th century, because these are really important topics. Another thing that's really important is that in around 1077, we begin to see, again, another instance of the Pope gaining a crazy power over secular states when the Pope excommunicated Henry IV. And as a result of this, Henry IV actually stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside of the castle of Canossa, begging the Pope for forgiveness. And again, this just shows that this is the emperor of the state who is begging the Pope for forgiveness. And you see, again, it's just the sort of the papal power that the Pope had over the state. And then moving further into history, around 1095, this is when you began to see the Pope rallying for to battle against Islam and the spread of Islam, essentially. And so at this time, Pope Urban II preached a sermon, when in it he called for a holy war to rescue the East and liberate Jerusalem. And the crowd replied during the sermon that God wills it. And because of this resulted in the launching of the First Crusade. Something that's very important here is that there is a very good chance that the reason Pope Urban II decided to do this was to try and reunify with East by helping them out, hopefully hoping that they would then in return reunite with the West after what has been about 40 years of split. Obviously, this did not happen, but that's probably there's a good reason. That's one of the reasons he did do this, and they did try to attack and battle against Islam. However, as a result of the First Crusade, something pivotal did happen in 1099, right on the brink of the 12th century. The Crusaders did manage to breach the walls of Jerusalem and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. However, this is, at one hand, you could say that it was a great conquering by the Christians. On the other hand, it turned out to be devastating because they kind of ruined the victory by having a horribly brutal massacre of the city's inhabitants as a result of the battling against or capturing of Jerusalem. The Crusaders absolutely murdered so many of the city's inhabitants, many that you would describe as non-combative in nature. And so this really would put a dark spot on the crusade. Now, people can argue whether or not this was justified or not, depending on your view, and there's people who argue in general about whether or not the Crusades were justified or not. That's not my job here. My job is just to, again, just try and give these big, important, the very, very big, important stuff here that is that's going to cover the centuries and be that show you what the most important things within the century is. I don't know why that was so hard to get out. I'm trying to give you the most important points within these centuries. And for the 11th century, that is essentially what this all was. Now, before we move on to the 12th century, I do want to make something known, and I do want to maybe apologize a little bit. I am sorry if I'm going fast with this, or if maybe I'm not covering it to the extent that you would hope. The reason why I'm going through this so fast because at this time, it really becomes a deal of trying not to go too deep into political history, but rather maintaining church history. To me, when I'm trying to do these and when I'm looking at what I want to talk about, when I want to explain from church history, I want to focus on those theological things or those big breaks in Christianity or big events within Christianity that would go on to influence Christianity for a while. And politically, there are a lot of things that influence Christianity. But also, there's a lot of things politically that really didn't have. At some point within these last centuries, you're going to see that political Christianity, politics and Christianity kind of become one and the same in the Western history. Because again, as we just discussed, the Pope begins to take over all of this other this power. Things like this, the Decretus Papae are popping up, where the Pope is claiming this power over secular states, right? And so because of that, politics and religion are deeply intertwined because you begin to see religious states appearing. And those are very important for Christian history. However, if I want to just cover the things that are theologically important or that would go on to shape Christianity as a whole in the future, I'm not as interested in describing those. There's maybe a point in the future where we will come back and we will do an episode on these very specific political events within Christianity. But broadly, that's not what the point of what this specific series is. This specific series is going to be, again, just probably 3 episodes where we go over the very basics of church history, broad church history. And hopefully it'll work out so that you can come away from this with a good understanding of general church history, and you can go do your own research into these things deeper, and maybe you'll go and do your own deeper research into political Christian history. Again, that's just not the point for this specific series that we're doing here. However, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the 12th century and move on from the 11th century. Now, when it comes to the 12th century, we really don't see too many things that are important separate from political Christianity. However, there are some notable things that occurred. Most notably, the 12th century broadly was kind of seen as a renaissance for the Western Church because there was a big boom in scholasticism. And for example, earlier we talked about how the scholasticism had set the foundation for the universities. Well, this is really where we began to see the true birth of the universities and such popping up, and where you began to see the baseline work that was supposed to be done in them formed by people like Peter Lombard. So when it comes to the 12th century, let's just start at the beginning and we'll go through some of the most important points. So at the beginning of the 12th century, around 1122, you had something occur called the Concordat of Worms. So what this was a treaty between Pope Callistus II and then the emperor, who was Henry V at the time. And what this did is this formal treaty or agreement ended the investiture controversy. And so this was a compromise, essentially, that dictated that the kings could no longer invest individually within bishops with spiritual symbols, but they could still be present at elections and such and grant secular property rights. And so this was, in a way, sort of a separation from church from state, which is actually impressive seeing as they were being blended so heavily. And then beyond this, we began to see um, a clash between the ages of reason and the ages of mysticism. Again, this is stuff that you began to see earlier, but would come to fruition here. So 1140 ish, there was a big showdown between two giants at the time. This was Bernard of Clairvaux, I think that's how you say it. I'm so bad with names, and Peter Abelard, and these both were battled against each other to see which position would win. So Bernard was a champion of just traditional faith, where Peter was a champion of reason very heavily. Now, at this time, surprisingly, Bernard actually secured a condemnation of Abelard's teachings, and so at the time, this was a very temporary victory for mysticism or classic faith over the big rising scholastic rationalistic type of mindset that was coming into the Western Church. And obviously, we know that the scholastic rationalistic mindset would eventually become champion with people like Thomas Aquinas, who began to get very popular. But regardless, still very important to point out that at this time, it didn't win, which was very, very surprising. Another thing that happened was the fall of Edessa occurred. This was a Crusader state, but it actually fell to Turkish Muslim armies. And so because of this, it got the Pope to essentially to commission people to preach about a second crusade. And as a result, the Second Crusade was indeed kicked off. And it was a less successful one, but it was still somewhat successful. Again, we saw that universities began to be popped up here, and Peter Lombard, who's a very important person in Catholic history, he's a bishop of Paris. He published his 4 books of sentences, and this was essentially the standard textbook or manual of theology for the study in those universities that had begun to be born here. And it remained this way for about 300 years. So this was a very, very big move for the Roman Catholic Church, and having a system established for 300 years to be used in universities. So their theology was very much getting ironed out at this time. And it was very much a systemized form of Christian doctrine. It was done more thoroughly in this instance than it ever had been before. Another very important thing that happened, this last thing we'll cover here, was in 1187, the very popular Muslim military leader Saladin captured Jerusalem. And after this, you may be surprised about this, the Catholic Church would then use this as a spark to go on their third crusade. So at this point, you're starting to see crusades just happening over and over and over again. Obviously, that wouldn't end well, or wouldn't end super well for the Catholic Church, but this was the response, is that if you're going to take something from us, we're going to send a crusade and battle against you. And broadly, those are the most important things that happened within the 12th century. Again, you began to see a rise in scholasticism, but rationalism was actually defeated a bit at a point later to have another rise. But you see universities pop up. You see people like Peter Lombard appearing and systematizing Catholic doctrine. And so this is very important for the general Christian history in how rationalism developed. But beyond that, and beyond the Crusades, there isn't a ton to go into there. So with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the 13th century. So following the 12th century, which itself had some very important times for Christianity, events that happened within Christianity, the 13th century would follow in a very similar suit. And so I'm just going to go over some of the most important things that happened here. And this century is so jam-packed with events that it's almost impossible that I won't accidentally skip over one. So if I do, please be sure, with all of these centuries, in fact, be sure to mention down below, hey, this happened in this century. I think it's important for people to know. Just wanted to maybe left it out. Please do that. It's impossible for me to be perfect in all of this, so please, especially I'm doing this solo, and it's a lot more difficult to do this type of thing solo than with a co-host. So please let me know down below if I miss anything. Please inform people, inform me. I also it'll be very helpful for me, I promise. So, starting at the very beginning of the 13th century, you had one of the most devastating events for Christianity and for relations with the East and West as a whole for the rest of history. And this was in 1204 with the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. So at this time, Western Crusaders within the Fourth Crusade were had their aim set on Egypt. That's where they're going to go to battle against the Muslims. However, on their way there, they diverted their attention to Constantinople, which was an Eastern Orthodox stronghold. And they went to Constantinople and absolutely brutally sacked the city, murdered people, destroyed things. It was bad. After they were done, they installed a Latin king and patriarch there. And that right there was the nail in the coffin. All hopes for reunification between the East and West are done for. The Western Church has put a nail in the coffin, did something they had no need to do, and absolutely brutally murdered in many innocent people. There's actually a quote from I believe it's someone who's unknown, or just the general sentiment of the time from the people of the East, that essentially stated that they would have been happier under the Muslims because the Muslims treated them better than the Western Roman Catholic Church did. Again, that's the nail in the coffin between the East and the West. That's a very big reason why there's still so much heat between those two people, those two groups today, is because of the fact that that was such a huge deal that it ruined relationships for forever. Moving on to the further on to the 13th century, in 1215 there was a very big development in the Fourth Lateran Council, and you may be confused about, hey, the Fourth Lateran Council, we didn't go over any of the other ones, and that is true. We did not go over any of the Roman Catholic councils. So Roman Catholics have a lot more councils than the Eastern Orthodox. The reason why we're not going into them is because honestly, I don't want to do them a disservice by not going into them each into somewhat deep detail like we did with the first seven. And there's so many of them that I think it'd be better in the future just to go over one council per episode for the first through last council and do detailed overview of them, rather than just going over them so much. But this was a very important council because it defined a doctrine that one of the most important, if not the most important, within Roman Catholicism, some will state, other than the papacy, I guess I should say, and that is the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 defined the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the Roman Catholic doctrine of real presence in the Eucharist. Now, this essentially used Aristotelian philosophy to explain how Jesus is truly present and really present within the Eucharist. This is not the same form of real presence that the Eastern Orthodox hold to. The two views of real presence are very, very, very different. Roman Catholicism is very much, I guess, on the furthest extreme of real presence that there is. And I'm not going to go into the theology of transubstantiation here. We'll probably do that in a future episode when we go over the doctrines of the Lord's Supper and the Eucharist. However, suffice it to say that this was a very big development within Roman Catholicism to officially define their doctrine of the real presence and of transubstantiation. And going further into the 13th century, again, you had the Council of Lyons, which happened in 1274, and at this was essentially an attempt to reunite the Greek and Latin churches. But I mean, the damage done again earlier was just too much, and so this attempt was eventually just obviously a failed attempt in the end. And there was a lot of attempt here from politically to reunite the two, and not just religiously, but again, that just failed too because of the damage that had been done. And then within 1274, you had the death of Thomas Aquinas. But really, here I want to sum up the life and the death of Thomas Aquinas, because he is probably the church's, the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church's greatest medieval theologian. Some will argue the greatest theologian for the Roman Catholic Church as a whole, for the Western Church as a whole. He defined the philosophical method that the Roman Catholic Church still holds to this day, and that is Thomism. And he left behind a huge monolithic work of theology that is the Summa Theologiae, which is a synthesis of the biblical revelation with Aristotelian logic and such to define Roman Catholic theology and beliefs, and this became the standard for the Catholics for centuries to come. Some today still do believe that it is the golden standard for Roman Catholic theology, but the Summa Theologiae was incredibly important for the Roman Catholic Church in defining their theology. And again, Thomas Aquinas was very big in finding a synthesis between Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic Christian theology. Now, moving on, we have the 14th century here, which is the final century that we are covering today, and this was a interesting century to say the least. There's a very, very big development in the papacy here that we are going to go over, and that is Unum Sanctum. So, what is Unum Sanctum? So, this was a papal bull that was put out by Pope Boniface VIII. And so what this bull issued is, it declared that submission to the Roman pontiff is completely and absolutely necessary for salvation. Beyond this, that's already a very, very big a change and a very big, again, elevation of papal power. However, beyond this, it also claimed that the spiritual sword, which they called the church, judged and was to essentially look over and rule the temporal. Sorry, I couldn't think of the word. Temporal sword, which is the state as a whole. So this was the most extreme formulation of papal power up to this point. But it essentially it marked the beginning of an era where you began to see that the papacy is developing a lot, to the point later that we're going to get into in the next episode, to the point of things like Vatican II and papal infallibility. So you saw, again, this gradual development of the papacy. Now, some will argue that it was never a development. These things are just being stated clearly for the first time, but I think it's pretty clear here that you're seeing a development. Now, as a result of some of this type of stuff, in 1303, there was a lot of outrage. So, at this time, King Philip IV, who was King of France, actually was resisting papal authority, and because of this, sent agents to arrest Pope Boniface VIII. And they stormed the capital, or the palace rather, and went after him. Now, Pope Boniface was actually rescued at this time, although he did die of shock later on. But essentially what this did is said, no. When it comes to matters like these, the state is more powerful than the papacy. And so it's a lot of, essentially a show of force from the state. But broadly, again, it just went on to show that the papacy had developed to a point of claiming power and authority over the state, and then the state responding in the way that, obviously, you wouldn't be surprised the state is responding like this at all. Or at least you wouldn't think that the state would be responding like this. Moving further on, there was some other things within the papacy that happened. For example, Pope Clement X actually made a huge, very, very big thing happen when he moved the papal court to on the border of the French border. Um, and so this was big because this was moving again the papacy out of Rome and essentially to France. Um, and later this would obviously be moved back. About 70 years later, they would move this back. But still, I mean, an important thing, event that happened. We're going to see the development of the papacy and the controversies within the papacy. That is one of them. Once that happened, um, the Black Death happened around this time, and although it doesn't have to do strictly with church history, it was a big influence on the church, as it did a lot of damage to the church, and a lot of lay people died, and it was very very sad, but it led to a development in theology surrounding things like death, and that's sort of why it's important. You saw a further explanation of things like purgatory and such around this time within the Roman Catholic Church. And then beyond this, the most important thing after this, in my opinion, that happened in the 14th century was actually the Wycliffe Bible. And this is a very important story within Protestantism today. A lot of people cite John Wycliffe as an example of like a first reformer or something, but in reality, what John Wycliffe did was translate the Bible. He was the first one to do this. To translate or produce a translation from Scripture from its Latin roots into English. However, this actually would go on to essentially challenge, in a way, the church's exclusive control over Scripture, and it would lay the groundwork, in a lot of people's opinion, for the Reformation, due to things like the church's response to this, and due to, in general, the desire that people like John Wycliffe had to spread the Bible in English, or to a more accessible language to people. And so a lot of people say that type of thing went on to lay the foundations for what would come in the Reformation very, very soon, which is something that we're going to be talking about in the next episode. And is obviously one of the biggest events, if not the biggest event in Christianity, maybe even bigger, probably even more bigger in its eventual results than the Great Schism itself. But yeah, that is really all for the 14th century. And with that, I really don't have anything else for you guys today. I hope that this was interesting. I hope that this maybe helped you guys learn a little bit. Again, sorry, it's really different doing a podcast knowing that my co-host isn't here. Obviously, Daniel and I are great friends, so it really sucked to have to do this solo. But things happen, and when things happen, we're ready to adapt. And hopefully this was interesting. If it was really super super bad, I'm sure we'll redo it in the future. But maybe it turned out okay. We'll see. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. Again, if there's anything I missed, please leave it down in the comments down below. If there's any other important events that you think people should know about that weren't mentioned here, or any important details that can be expounded upon, please leave them down in the comment section below. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Share it with people if you think it's worthy of being shared. And above all, again, thank you so much for watching. And hopefully we'll have the next church history episode out somewhat soon. Then we'll get into some more exciting stuff after that, like theology and such. So stick around for that, and stick around for updates regarding all of that. All right, one final time, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate the support, and I hope that this was enjoyable. And with that, God bless, and have a good day.